Well, Tim asked me a few weeks ago to do this, and I had about 8 different ideas come to mind, and that was overwhelming. And I was like, I have to decide. So I talked to Madison a couple nights ago. She called me and said, happy birthday. I said, maybe you can help me since you're not here and you're not going to hear it. So she's to blame if this goes wrong. And she said, well, tell me what you have. So I said my list. And she's like, well, you know what? I really like it when you taught on Mephibosheth. That was great. So I'm like, okay, so if you're not familiar with Mephibosheth, you're going to get introduced to a character that we have essentially 4 days of his life cataloged in the Bible. So he's an interesting character. His life intersects with David, and that takes us to 1st and 2nd Samuel, which is where the men are on Monday night. So it's kind of a looking ahead for some of the guys. We're going to get to this eventually, and you'll get a taste of what it looks like on a Monday night when we go through the Word. And we'll also hopefully have a glimpse of the heartache and the joy of one man's life and a picture of the love of God in your life. Okay? So let's start in 2 Samuel 4. Mephibosheth in 4 days is my title. So 4 days, if you could break your life down, would you have 4 impactful days that might be recorded in the Bible that people for all time would read about? Can you think of 4 crossroads days that may be significant in some sense to reveal God's heart? Because that's what Mephibosheth's life is. And just kind of keep that in mind. He was a real guy. He actually lived. He suffered like you do. He had questions like you do. He had joys like you do. And he wrestled with and had to come to grips with difficult things. So 2 Samuel 4, verse 4 is our first introduction. Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son who was lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. And his nurse took him up and fled. And it happened as she made haste to flee that he fell and became lame. His name was Mephibosheth. So here's a healthy little boy. His dad is the crown prince. His dad is the heir to the throne. He's the oldest son of his dad. So he's now actually in the kingly line as the heir to the throne, kind of that whole concept of the succession. So King Saul, first king of Israel, his son Jonathan is a loyal general, but his son Jonathan is also a great and true friend of David. So let's go from this point. Jezreel is the time where Saul, Jonathan, and Jonathan's 2 younger brothers all died in battle at the hands of the Philistines. So that's the last chapter of 1 Samuel. So if you can put yourself in the position of the nurse, she gets news that Saul is dead, Jonathan and the brothers are dead. In the concept of ancient Israel, 2 things are going through that nurse's mind, and this is why she panics. If you can kind of guess them, extra credit to you. 1, she's got the king in front of her is what she's thinking, because he's the oldest of Jonathan's kids. And 2, if she doesn't get him out of there, David's been kind of anointed in a known quantity as the next kind of king. And she's panicking because in that ancient concept of usurping the throne or taking over the throne, whoever comes and takes over the throne then wipes out the entire family of the prior king. So that there's no opportunity for civil war eventually or raising up another king. We see that with Athaliah later in Joash. So the priest hid Joash. He was a little boy. He was a baby. Athaliah wiped out all of Joash's family, but she didn't know about him. He was a little baby. So Joash becomes the boy king at 5 years later. But she tried to do that. She tried to wipe everybody out so that no one would be raised up as the king in her place again and toss her or her son from the throne. So this is the idea. We don't really experience it in America, right? It's kind of election, and it's sort of way over here in left field for us. It's a foreign concept. But this is what was going on. the idea of David may come in, and what if David kills everybody? That's the fear. And she needs to protect the next, apparently, the king, So Mephibosheth, in this kind of turning point day of a 5-year-old boy's life, doesn't say he wasn't healthy. You could kind of assume he was healthy until he's dropped. Probably shatters both of his lower legs, because it sounds like he's healthy beyond the crippling of his legs. But now what? Right? Now what? So let's go back 14 years. This is one of those hard days, but let's go back 14 years and flip back to 1 Samuel 18. This is on the heels of David's victory over Goliath. David is 16 years old. He was just recently anointed by Samuel because God had rejected Saul. Saul knew he had been rejected. Saul sensed that the Spirit of God had left him. So now, and this is kind of the backstory that Mephibosheth doesn't understand when he's dropped. He doesn't understand this. But we can understand it in the Word because we understand the backstory that after David defeated Goliath, Saul spoke to him. Saul kind of got the details of David. And Saul said, "You're one of my guys. You're going to be in my army. You're my man." And Saul was at first enamored with him. And it says in verse 1, when Saul had finished speaking to David, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. There was some, remember the speech that David gave to Goliath? Goliath is mocking him out on the battlefield, and David's like, "Hey, you know what? You want to mock me all you want, but my God is He's going to deliver you, and I'm going to feed your body to the birds. And I'm going to have your head on a stick." And in the kind of the bravado between the two, something happened in Jonathan's heart, and he's like, "That guy is amazing. He's fearless." But he's fearless in the Lord, right? He's fearless in the Lord. But yet, David and Jonathan began this really tight friendship. Jonathan was about 20 years older than David. David is 16. Jonathan's in his mid-30s. And there's this, not even a mentor, but there's an equals. Heart to heart, they challenge each other. They have the same mentality. Jonathan was the one who took the risk and went up the wall against the Philistines. And so there's this camaraderie among them, not just as warriors, but as men. And in that, Jonathan goes a step further if you read in chapter 18, verse 2. So Saul took him that day, and that's kind of explained in prior chapters, that whenever Saul recognized a valiant and brave man in the kingdom, he took him to be part of his army, part of his crew. And that's what they were warned was going to happen. And David became one of those guys that Saul took. He was no longer accessible for his family to work as the shepherd boy he once was. He's now in the army. And it's a draft. It's a form of a draft. And he would not let him go home to his father's home. Verse 3, then Jonathan and David made a covenant because Jonathan loved David as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with all of his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. So what is going on? That, if you don't understand, it could seem weird, but it's not weird at all, because actually this is the moment where Jonathan recognizes God's hand on David. Jonathan says, the kingly robe, I lay it aside. The sword of war, I lay it aside. The bow, I lay aside. He's abdicating the throne to David visibly. He says, David, I'm not getting in the way. I know God's hand is on you. I love you as my own soul. I'm not going to interfere. You're going to be the king one day, and I know it. Jonathan was the heir to the throne, right? Jonathan had the right to expect to be the heir to the throne as the oldest of Saul's boys. Jonathan immediately recognizes and lays it aside. Is that clear? Does that make sense? But that isn't all that Jonathan does. Go over a couple chapters and go to chapter 20, verse 14. Jonathan and David are wrestling through what is going on. Seems like Saul's after me, because all of a sudden Saul begins realizing. Look in chapter 20, verse 31. This is Saul and Jonathan having a conversation. As long as the son of Jesse, Saul speaking to Jonathan, as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, that he shall surely die. Saul had a couple of motivations to try and kill David. One of them was so that Jonathan could be the king. The other one is he was just flat jealous, and he was afraid of David. All three of those things were told that Saul kind of freaked when David arrived on the scene and was just so powerfully impressive among the people and in battle. And Saul knew that God's hand was on David. So what is this all leading to? Go back a few verses to verse 14. David and Jonathan having a conversation. In verse 14, you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. This is Jonathan speaking. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord require it at the hand of David's enemies. Now Jonathan again caused David to vow because he loved him, for he loved him as his own soul. Same phrase. But understand what he's asking and what they agree to. That even when David succeeds to the throne, don't forget to show not only me kindness, but to my entire family. Remember to show me kindness. So the day that Mephibosheth, so that's all the backstory. The day that Mephibosheth in chapter 4, 2 Samuel 4:4, we're given this insight. Saul, Jonathan, and his brothers go out to battle. They're wiped out. The Philistines kill them. Saul's being carried, his body, his head. But at the same time, word gets back. The nurse panics because she realizes they're all dead. He's the one. So she takes him, trying to care for him. She drops him. He's broken legs, whatever. And he's crippled. So the question then is, how could a good God, right? How could a loving God? How tragic, how sad. But that's not the end of the story. And it's actually not the beginning of the story. Because the beginning of the story is David and Jonathan. The first day we see of Mephibosheth, this is prior to Mephibosheth even being alive. Jonathan may not have had kids at the time because Mephibosheth was his oldest. So we're looking at David and Jonathan thinking about their future. And in fact, in chapter 23, Jonathan goes to David and he's like, hey man, you know what? When you get the throne, I'll be like your right-hand man and our families will grow together and it'll be good. Jonathan had an expectation and a hope that this friendship and this bond was going to be a long time coming. But it was cut short for Jonathan. And here's Mephibosheth, a 5-year-old boy who's lost his grandpa. He's lost his uncles. He's lost his dad. And now he can't walk. And what does that mean for a future? He can't work. He's going to go, in a day, he's going to go from the palace. And considering the throne as my future, he may not even thought about that as a 5-year-old, but the people around him probably did. To the future is what? I'm being chased out of the city and now I'm in the wilderness. So let's go over to, there's a period of silence. David takes the throne. He's established. He is now the king. And this process of time from Jezreel to when David is finally established and settled as the king over both Judah and the northern tribes of Israel, where it's a combined and a unified kingdom again, is about 15 years. So David was 30 when he took the throne. Mephibosheth was 5 years old. 15 years go by. It's now David's 45 years old. Everything, the dust is settled. The nations around them are subdued. They're all paying tribute. David begins thinking, I think I'll build God a great house. God says, you're a man of war. You can't build me a house. I'll build you a house, though. I'll establish your line. I'll actually bring the Messiah through your line. But you can't build me a house, David. So David's like, okay. That's amazing. God has done this great thing for me. So he begins thinking, the dust is settled. He doesn't have to subdue the kings and nations around him anymore. He's kind of considering life again. David was a doer, but now he's beginning to think. And you know what? The covenant with Jonathan. So chapter 9, 2 Samuel chapter 9. Now David, 15 years later, David's 45 years old, he's contemplating. And this comes to mind. Now David said, you know what? Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul? Then I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake. Now you might think, wow, 15 years. Nice of you to remember, David. Gosh, that was 35 years ago. What are you doing, dude? But David was a busy guy. We've been talking in the men's study that it was a theocracy. Saul ruled for around 33 to 35 years. It was an entirely new government system, so there's all this kind of stuff to deal with. David's the second king. There's more bureaucracy. You're kind of settling how does the kind of government, apart from just judges telling you what God said. So there's a lot of loose ends to tie up. 15 years in, David considers it now. So it's 15 years later. So how old is Mephibosheth? He's 20. He's a man. He's got a boy. He's actually, there's nothing said about his wife, but his wife may have died in childbirth. Who knows? But here's Mephibosheth, and we're going to find out a few details about him at this point. So for Jonathan's sake, David kind of asks the cabinet members, those around him, his servants, hey, does anybody know? Remember Saul's group, Saul's entire family? Does anybody know? Is there anybody left? And pretty soon here comes a servant from Saul's house named Ziba. And this guy's an interesting character. We'll kind of touch on him in a little bit. So when they called Ziba, they brought him to David, and the king asked him, are you Ziba? He's like, at your service. And actually he's a flatterer, and you'll see it in a little bit. Then the king said, is there not still someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? 4 times in this chapter we're told the kindness of God. Actually 3 times. 3 times the kindness of God is brought up. And whenever you see something repeated, it isn't just David doing it to show off. He isn't doing it so that people think, oh wow, David's a great king. Or the Word of God, when it repeats a phrase like this, it is emphasizing this is actually something that God's moved on his heart to do. So it's distinct from his kind of selfishly wanting to appeal and be the noble king that everybody thinks highly of. You know what I mean? There's a different motive there. Different motive to those. So Jonathan is desiring to show the kindness, or David's desiring to show the kindness of God for Jonathan's sake, but it's spurred by the Spirit of God in him. Okay? Ziba said to the king, oh, there is still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet. The plot thickens kind of a thing, right? Whether that's a detail that Ziba needed to say or not, it's kind of curious that he even throws it out there. I wonder if anyone even mentioned Mephibosheth in the 15 years since he was hurt in the palace, in the kingdom. I wonder because where he ends up going. So the king said to him, where is he? Do you think Mephibosheth would have known the friendship between his dad and King David? At 5 years old, I'm not sure that he would have. During the window of time that Mephibosheth was born, David was pursued by Saul for 14 years. He was chased as a partridge through the wilderness. Saul had it in his mind to wipe David out for Jonathan. Jonathan didn't want him to do it. Whether there was kind of this friction between Jonathan and Saul the whole time, was Jonathan griping about his dad? I doubt it. His dad was the king. The king had the right to do whatever he wanted, right? So Mephibosheth, it might have been a mystery whether or not King David knew who he was or where he was or had any thought of him at all. So we'll find out. So where is he? Ziba said to the king, oh, indeed, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lo-Debar. So Lo-Debar is a little bit outside of the Jordan River Valley, kind of to the west side. The archaeologists think there's a little town there that has a similar wording, similar phrasing. But the meaning of it is a pastureless land or a barren wasteland, or it's pretty dry and there's nothing there. So he went from the palace in perfect health. In one day, he's crippled, and he ends up being far off, out in the wilderness, separate from everything that he loved and was cared for him. Those who were close to him, those who would have been his mentors, are gone. And now he's unable to work in kind of a barren area for 15 years. No explanation, no reason. Went from being in the palace, the son of the king, grandson of the king, to a forgotten, forsaken life. How sad, right? So we have 4 days, though. We've only heard one day. The one day was the crippling. So this is day 2. Day 2, King David begins thinking, what about Jonathan's family? Now, verse 5, King David sent and brought him out of the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, from Lodabar. So this is the day 2. What does a day look like for Mephibosheth in Lodabar? His feet are crippled. He's probably sitting on the porch staring out. Probably tries to help a little bit, but he can't do a whole lot. Think about the cripples around the pool in Siloam, like the pool of Siloam, where they're trying to get into the healing waters, and I just need someone to help me. And it's a race, and the first one in gets healed, kind of that thing in the New Testament. The crippling in that culture was tough. It's tough in our day and age, but how much worse without the technology, without the medical type things that we have in our day and age. So here's Mephibosheth. With the background of royalty, do you think he lives in some fear? Like, what if people who loved Saul someday come and say, we want to make you the king and overthrow David? Do you think there's some of that? I think there is. Honestly, I think that's part of the reason why he's hidden kind of out as far away as he can get. And yet here come emissaries from the king. Where's Mephibosheth, right? They might try and reassure him, but so does the FBI or the CIA, right? When they're coming to get you, they try and reassure you. No, everything's good. We just need to ask a few questions. And, so this is the concern. I think, and it actually bears it out in verse 7. He was probably terrified. This might be curtains. This might be the end. When the king summons you, you don't say no. When the king sends people to come and get you, you're going to go. And this is probably a 3 to 4 hour journey by donkey, by cart. I would guess that it was kind of a long 3 or 4 hours in his mind, wondering what is going on. He has no expectation and he has no understanding of the prior covenant. Right? So he's kind of in the dark. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't understand the conversation that happened already with Ziba or what God's been doing in David's heart. Now when Mephibosheth, verse 6, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and prostrated himself. He wasn't challenging him. He was broken. He was humble and he was fearful. And he didn't know what to expect and he had no expectation at all. David said his name for the first time, Mephibosheth. David knew his name and he had no context of who David was necessarily. And he answered, here is your servant. Humility. He's as low as he can get, right? He's prostrate on the ground, head down. Your servant. And this is what David dispels. Do not fear, Mephibosheth. Don't fear. This isn't about terrifying you. This isn't about bringing things to a horrible end for you. For I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake. In fact, I'll restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather. And you shall eat bread at my table continually. What a day. That was a ride worth taking, right? So can you imagine Mephibosheth probably sitting on the porch staring at his feet every day. I think I would stare at my feet every day. What is going on? If my feet only worked, I could probably work. I could be useful. I could make something of my life a little bit. My son might have a hope and a future, but I'm stuck. Probably a little bit bitter, probably a little bit aggravated. Feeling thrown to the curb maybe, feeling like, what's the point? And yet here's David. One, don't fear. He was afraid. If David's saying don't fear, he was afraid. He was terrified, I would imagine. Remember the story of Esther where the queen, is it Vashti or Esther herself, they were hoping to get an audience with the king? Was it Esther? She was hoping to get an audience. And she needed him just to lift the scepter. If he didn't lift the scepter, she would be put to death. Because it's a brazen thing to step into the king's presence without the king summoning you. And to be brought into the king's presence and not know why might be awful terrifying itself. So here's Mephibosheth, probably wrestling with what in the world did you just say? He didn't say repeat it. He said, who am I that you should look upon such a dead dog as me? Why am I even here? He didn't necessarily say thanks. He said, that's about the craziest thing I've ever heard. What are you doing that for? And he views himself as a dead dog. I don't think it's hyperbole. I think he was brought pretty low. He was a broken man. It's in a man to do. It's in a man to build. It's in a man to accomplish. And part of the thing that stirs the life and the experience of a man is to do and to build and to be. And here's a guy he's struggling with, what is my purpose? How am I? How can I justify my existence, kind of a thing. He's living in a guy's house who's taken care of him for 15 years. And but David turns the tables. Let's read it again. I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. Mephibosheth bowed himself and said, what is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I? The king said, he called Ziba in, Saul's servant, and he said to him, Ziba, I've given to your master's son, Mephibosheth here, all that belonged to Saul and all of his house. So all of the wealth of King Saul has now been, by kingly order, transferred to Mephibosheth. Unimaginable abundance. He was just 5 hours ago sitting on a porch in the middle of a dust bowl, looking at his feet. Now he's before the king, and he's just been restored everything that Saul had as the king of Israel prior to David becoming the king. Can you imagine that? I think it was probably overwhelming. The king leaves Mephibosheth and he begins giving instruction to Ziba. You therefore and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him. You shall bring in the harvest, and your master's son may have food to eat. This is speaking of Mephibosheth's boy. So Micah is his name. David's saying, and he knows about Mephibosheth's son even. This is interesting. David did some research. Ziba, you're going to work so that Micah has food, but Mephibosheth is going to eat with me. He's going to be as one of my sons at my table. He's going to always eat bread at my table. 4 times it says at my table. Interesting. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. When's the last time you heard a servant having servants? This guy was a bureaucrat. He was in Saul's government for 30 years. He has 15 sons, 20 servants, and he's still a wealthy servant. And he's in fact already taking care of this land. So when David summoned Ziba, Ziba knew about him. He knew about Mephibosheth, but he never went and got him. He wasn't the one who went and pursued Mephibosheth and said, hey, you know what? We're taking care of Saul's land anyway. Come and live with us. Be here. He didn't care about that. But David established it. So now Ziba's wealth, in essence, is transferred to Mephibosheth. Ziba's lost what he had, but he still gets to take care of it. Then Ziba said to the king, oh, according to all that my lord the king has commanded his servant, so your servant will do. And he does it outwardly, but inwardly, he's like, I'm going to get mine. And you watch, and we'll get to that in a minute. So this is Ziba entering the picture. He's a flatterer. As for Mephibosheth, the king said, he shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons. So David at this time, he had 6 boys in the first 7 years before the kingdom was unified. So he was the king over Judah for 7 years, and then he was the king over the rest for 33, 40 total. The first 7 years he had 6 boys in Hebron, and all of those boys are under 15. So they're all kind of growing up in the house. That's Amnon, Adonijah, some of the guys that had a lot of the problems. Later on, we'll get to those when we're in the men's study, but we won't talk about them too much. But those guys they're all David's different wives from his different treaties, and it created a mass problem in the house because the boys are all sort of rivals because they don't all share the same mom, and it's kind of this weirdness that happened. Absalom, Amnon, and Adonijah were the three well-known ones. He's going to be as one of the king's sons, though. So Mephibosheth is going to have a place. He's going to have a presence in the house daily. Can you imagine that? David's bringing him right back into the palace. Now understand, Mephibosheth, if we're looking at it from kingly lines, there might be some who still think, well, he's actually the heir to Saul's throne. David's the usurper, right? There are some who might believe that still. But David is the one that God put his hand on and said, no, Saul is no longer king. I'm taking the throne and giving it to David. And that's what Samuel explained. So here we go. Mephibosheth, verse 12, had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he ate continually at the king's table, and he was lame in both of his feet. So the last sentence is interesting to me because it didn't solve all the problems. Sure changed the outlook, though, but it didn't solve all the problems. Life still happens. Tough things are still there. He still wakes up every morning and looks at his feet. That's not easy. That's kind of frustrating. But such grace from the king. He didn't pursue it. He wasn't looking for it. The king pursued him, right? He didn't look for it. He didn't expect it. But for the sake of Jonathan, for the sake of this covenant that happened prior to his even being born, he was born into a covenant he had no idea of. Isn't that amazing? And now he's benefiting from something that he never even understood. So now let's go a few chapters further. Let's flip over to chapter 16. So chapter 16, David is forced to flee. This is about David's 35th year as king. So we're now 20 more years down the road. So Mephibosheth is 40, David's 65. We're kind of in the last window of David's kingly career, and Absalom rises up and stirs the people against him. So if you've ever heard of, I don't want to be Absalom in the camp, have you heard that phrase as a Christian? People talk about it sometimes. Absalom became jealous of his dad. He was frustrated. He's like, I should be the king. My dad's a dummy. I think I'm going to... So what Absalom came up with this plan is he got up early in the morning and he went out and sat at the gate. And whenever people came, because they would come to the gate with their disputes or their frustrations, And Absalom said, you know what, there's nobody from the king's palace right now that really cares, but tell me your problem and I'll help you. And he did this long enough that he began stirring people. You know what, the king doesn't really care about you. I care about you though. And pretty soon he had this little faction of people, and he roped in some of the military guys. And all of a sudden, there's an announcement, Absalom's the king. Absalom's the king. And David flees. David doesn't want to fight Absalom. He kind of backs out. He's like, you know what, Absalom, you make your mistake, you do your thing. I'm going to get out of town. I'm going to ride it out, rather than killing his own son. So this is when David is fleeing. In chapter 16, we see a nugget where Ziba makes a calculation. Ziba is a calculating politician, and he comes to David with all kinds of supplies. David was a little bit past the top of the mountain there, chapter 16, verse 1. And there was Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, who met him with a couple of saddled donkeys, and on them there were 200 loaves of bread, all kinds of provisions. And the king said to Ziba, what do you mean to do with these? And Ziba said, oh, these donkeys are for the king's household. Oh, the summer fruit, it's for the young men to eat. And the wine is for those who are faint in the wilderness. And the king said, well, where is your master's son? And Ziba said to the king, so where is Saul's son? So he's speaking of Mephibosheth. Where's Mephibosheth? Indeed, he's staying in Jerusalem, for he said, today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me. So Ziba made up a story that Mephibosheth is hoping to be named the king today. So this is a story where we're talking about 4 days in the life of Mephibosheth. He's crippled, he's restored, and now he's slandered. This is day 3. You've been restored, but you still get slandered. Hard things happen that are out of your control. People say things, do things, they have their motives, and it puts you in a bad light. So David isn't really sure what to think. And he says, well, here's all that belongs to Mephibosheth. It's all now yours. And now we see why Ziba was doing this, right? He's a politician. He's playing the game. He's after mine. I'm going to get mine. And he says, oh, I humbly bow before you. Can you see him doing this? It's like the Disney characters, you know, the way the bad guys are. That I may find favor in your sight, O Lord, O my Lord the King, right? I really don't like Ziba. Mephibosheth has no control over this story that's being told. And in fact, when you go to chapter, let's go over a couple chapters. Chapter 19. A couple years go by till Absalom comes to an untimely death and David comes back to the city. And when David comes back to the city, Mephibosheth meets him at the edge of the city. So, verse 24. Now, Mephibosheth, verse 24, chapter 19. The son of Saul came down to meet the king. And he had not cared for his feet, nor trimmed his mustache, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he returned in peace. Doesn't look or sound like a guy who was thinking he was going to become king. Right? So immediately David realizes somebody was telling a fib. And he asked him, so it was when he had come to Jerusalem to meet the king, that the king said to him, why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? Such a gentle question, I think. He could have said a lot of other things. They could have had him killed on the spot if he had believed Ziba totally. Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? Kind of reminds me of the way in the garden. What have you done, Adam? What have you done? Because I think David understood. Mephibosheth was stuck in the wilderness on a porch staring at his crippled feet. Ziba came and he's like, oh no, he didn't want to come. He was ready to be a king. And all of a sudden, here we have Mephibosheth trying to get to the king, and David realizes, you know what? Give me this story, Mephibosheth. Just give me your side of it. I need to hear your side of it. So this is day 4, right? 4 days of Mephibosheth. And these are the only passages where he's mentioned except in a lineage. So it was when he had come to Jerusalem to meet the king. Why didn't you come with me, Mephibosheth? My lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For your servant said, your servant being me, For I said, I'm going to saddle a donkey for myself that I might ride on it and go to the king, because your servant is lame. I needed a donkey. I couldn't walk to you. And he has slandered your servant to my lord the king, but my lord the king is like the angel of God. So I wanted to come. They wouldn't let me saddle the donkey and I couldn't come. What was I to do? But you're like an angel of God. Therefore, do what is good in your eyes. I leave it up to you. I wanted to come. You have to believe me or not. You're the one who brought me here. You're the one who fed me for 20 years. You're the one who cared for me when no one else did. For all my father's house were but dead men before my lord the king, yet you set your servant among those who eat at your own table. Therefore, what right do I have to cry out any more to the king? I mean, it's up to you. You brought me here. You cared for me. You provided for me. Who am I to say don't do this or don't do that? I mean, and I think that's the point. All my father's house were but dead men before my lord the king. You could have wiped out the entire family of Saul and been justified in the eyes of the world. In the eyes of everyone, you could have killed them all. Yet's a key word though. Yet you didn't. You set me among those who eat at your own table. Therefore, what right have I still to cry out any more to the king? I don't have anything to complain about. If you want to kill me now, kill me now. I leave it to you. You're like an angel of God. I can't judge, and I can't make a case one way or the other. So the king said to him, why do you speak any more of your matters? I've said, you and Ziba divide the land. So that doesn't really seem fair, right? Ziba should get his head cut off. That's what I think. But still, David is not necessarily like that in these matters. So I yield to David because what's happening is more an overall picture. God has painted a picture through the life of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth answers, and I think this is the richness of it all. He said to the king, rather, you know what? Let him take it all. I'm just glad you're back. So that's the last we hear of Mephibosheth. That's it. But if you understand, you who were once afar off have been brought near. You've been given every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. But God, who is rich in mercy, because of the great love with which He loved us, has poured out on us His love. He's provided everything which pertains to life and godliness in Christ Jesus. We feast at the table where we have no right to be because of His grace. And Mephibosheth experienced this in the first-hand way, in a physical manner, that we experience as believers in a spiritual manner. And we are blessed with abundant things physically, but we have no concept of the spiritual context of what we enjoy in Christ. This is a snapshot. This is a layer. When I talk about the many facets of how the Bible gives us, like a diamond has all these different facets and glimpses of the character and the nature of God, this is just one or two planes on the facet of a diamond. That we're getting a slight look behind the curtain through an illustration of one man's life, 4 days. I think it's remarkable. Because he doesn't say, you know what, Ziba betrayed me again. He never helped me before and he ripped me off this time. You should kill him. Mephibosheth isn't asking the king to kill him. He's not asking him to get back at him. He's not asking for everything. He's like, you know what? You gave it all to me in the first place. It's yours. Take it. I don't need it. I'm just glad to be with you again, because you're the difference between me and the barrenness that I was in. And I think sometimes we have to get to that place of the stuff, the things, the questions, the answers. You know what? It's just me and the Lord. It's like, I once was lost, but now I'm found. I once was blind, but now I see. I once had no hope, but now I have hope. And the difference is God. The difference is His faithfulness, His character, not me. And Mephibosheth arrived at that, and I just think it's remarkable. You know, it's kind of funny. I taught this one time before, but I stayed in chapter 9 and I never went to the other 2 chapters. I was like, holy smokes, there's so much more. And if you can arrive at a place where you're not holding on to the things around you, but you say, you know what? Let Him take it all. I don't care. It's you. We're not after the Lord for the things. We're after the Lord for Him. Does that make sense? We make a mistake in motive if we seek after the Lord like we're playing the stock market as an insurance policy to get something. I allow those things to get in my way when I have to arrive at verse 30 with Mephibosheth and say, you know what, rather, let it all go. Because the key thing is the key thing, and that's me and you. And if it's not me and you, then what am I? I'm back to being a dead dog and worthless, and I have no hope. But as it's me and you, as he's speaking to David, I'm speaking to God. It's like, God, it needs to be more real than me thinking I have to get something from you and maintain something from you. So at that point, there's just a beauty in it, and I don't know, I love it. I love it. And I feel like the word that the Lord would say is, have you met Him in that way? Have you responded to the grace that's poured out, the grace that's made available in a humility? Mephibosheth is the example of a broken, humble, zero expectation life that he's showered with love and grace. Grace is unmerited favor. There's nothing you can do to earn it. There's nothing you do to deserve it. It's outside of you. It's grace. And God opens the grace to us through the cross. He makes it available for you. And I know if there's a way, I was thinking the one song, that phrase, the heartbeat of my life. Like for Mephibosheth, he arrived at understanding being near David is the heartbeat of his life. Everything else is by the wayside. What's the heartbeat of your life? Are you at that place? Have you arrived at that place? I mean, I think we can all say I haven't fully arrived. You know, we're saddled with this old man that kind of weighs us down and distracts us. But man, is that your desire? To understand the heartbeat of my life is to be in His presence and rejoice in His presence for all He's done for me. So, Mephibosheth. Funny name, but quite a life, right? 4 days. 4 days in the life. Sometimes I do that when I go through the Bible. I think about Joseph. Joseph's life was changed in a day from a prison to second to Pharaoh in one day. Daniel, same thing. You know, Daniel was elevated in a day. Things happen in a day. You don't know what a day will hold. You know, it could be the crossroads of life, but it's going towards something. There's an end. There's an intended end that we don't yet know. We don't know the backstory. Sometimes we don't know the backstory. And we certainly don't know what it's headed to. But in the middle, we know God is in the process of it as we yield and humble ourselves. He's in process. So, hope in God. I think that's what I have. I'm going to end it there. Lord, thank you. Thank you so much, Lord, for the snapshot, the little snippets of one man's life. Understand, Lord, we don't even need all of the day-to-day, but you can distill it down into just a beautiful picture of your grace in our lives, your goodness, and, Lord, our response to you. Lord, we know that life isn't easy. Difficult things still come. But, Lord, we're thankful that you've restored us. You've forgiven us. You've brought us out of the miry clay and set our feet upon the rock. Lord, you've made us ambassadors of your love. And Lord, we want to walk out of these doors and we want to bless you. We want to share that message with others. Lord, help us to just follow in the footsteps like you set before us, Lord, those works that you have beforehand, that we can walk in them. Fill each one of us with your Spirit, Lord. If there's a heart crying out and a longing to know you in a deep way, Lord, will you meet that person? Lord, you promise that if we draw near to you with a humble heart, you'll draw near to us. So, Lord, accomplish your will today. Be glorified in us as a group, as a family, individually. Lord, thank you for your blessings in Jesus' name.